Before the eyes of the entire court, a young maid broke centuries of silence with a single unforgivable outburst, calling the most feared man in the kingdom a spoiled brat. The gasp of the nobility still hung in the air when he stepped toward her, not with fury, but with a dangerous, unreadable curiosity. In a castle where a whisper could cost a life, her defiance lit the spark of a battle neither pride nor desire could afford to lose. The main hall of the castle was a cathedral to power, every stone polished and gilded to remind those within of the crown's unyielding reach. Sunlight, fractured by tall, arched windows, spilled across the marble floor in pale gold, bright enough to catch on the gilt edges of frames and the jeweled clasps of noble cloaks. The air was heavy with the mingled scents of beeswax polish and too much perfume, undercut by something sharper, the faint metallic tang of tension. Margaret had never stood in a room so vast or so stifling. She lingered near the back, among the quiet rustle of servants, her apron newly laundered, her hands clasped before her to keep them from betraying a nervous tremor. It was her third day in the castle, and already she'd learned that the prince's presence could still a room in a way that no bell or command could. Edward was seated in the high-backed chair reserved for him, though he did not sit as others did. His body angled forward slightly, one hand on the carved armrest, the other lifted as he spoke with a measured sharpness. The man standing before him, an older servant whose hands twisted at his sides, was being chastised for a mistake too minor for this display. At least Margaret thought so. But here, minor offenses were magnified into lessons for all to witness. The prince's voice was smooth, almost quiet, yet it carried with the precision of a blade, every word cut. His eyes, pale and cold as winter light, swept the hall as though daring anyone to meet them. No one did. Not the lords standing along the side, their powdered wigs nodding in solemn agreement. Not the ladies, their silks whispering with the smallest shift of weight. The older servant bore the censure silently, shoulders bent under the invisible weight of shame. Margaret tried to fix her gaze on the floor, but the sound of that voice drew her eyes upward despite herself. Edward spoke with a calm cruelty, the kind that didn't raise its volume because it didn't need to. His authority was not only in his title, it was in the way people seemed to shrink when he addressed them. It made something coil in her stomach, a mixture of unease and an anger she could not quite suppress. Her place here was not secure enough to allow thoughts like these. She was nobody in this hall of high blood and gilded manners. Yet, as the prince continued, her hands unclasped at her sides, fingers curling slowly into her skirts, she had seen men like him before, in drawing rooms, at grand tables, men who believed the weight of their name entitled them to grind others down. The servant mumbled an apology, but it only sharpened the prince's expression. The pause between his words lengthened, stretching the humiliation thin and taut. Margaret became aware of her own breathing, too shallow, too fast. It was not fear, not entirely. It was the unbearable itch of injustice, the memory of watching her father bow to a man who had no right to stand so tall. Edward's tone shifted, colder now, as he delivered another rebuke, and Margaret's vision tunneled on the scene before her. The hall felt smaller, the air closer. Around her, no one moved, not a murmur, not a cough. Every face was lowered, every gaze carefully directed at polished shoes or embroidered cuffs. She could feel her pulse in her throat. Her voice broke from her before she realized she had decided to speak. "Shut your mouth, you spoiled brat!" The words landed like a thrown stone in still water. Gasps swelled from the edges of the room, rippling outward. Heads jerked up, eyes wide, as though the very ceiling might crack open from the shock. Servants froze mid-step, the clink of a silver tray arrested in the air. Edward stilled. It was not the stillness of surprise, but of something else, something more dangerous. Slowly, he turned his head, and his gaze found her with the precision of a drawn arrow. For a moment, neither moved. The room seemed to hold its breath. Margaret's heart pounded, but she did not look away. She told herself she would not be like the others, cowed into silence by the weight of his stare. His eyes lingered on her, traveling over her plain dress, her hair pulled back tightly, her unremarkable height, and yet he looked as if he'd discovered something rare. When he rose, it was with deliberate slowness. Each step toward her was measured, the quiet sound of polished boots on marble seeming unnaturally loud. People parted for him without thinking, their fear making way for his advance. He did not look at them. He looked only at her. Margaret stood her ground, though her pulse felt like a drumbeat against her ribs. He stopped just close enough that she could see the faint shadow along his jaw, could hear the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. The scent of leather and faint spice clung to him, sharper now that he was near. His gaze, clear and unblinking, held hers until she felt the edges of the room blur. A flicker of something unreadable passed across his expression. Not anger, not quite amusement, but an interest that unsettled her more than either. Then, without raising his voice, he spoke low enough that no one else could hear. The words made her breath catch in her chest. For a moment she wondered if she had misheard him. The words had been too quiet, the tone too even, yet their weight pressed against her chest with startling force. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Not with the hall's silence draped over her like a heavy cloak, not with the prince standing so close that she felt the faint stir of his breath against her temple. Edward's attention didn't waver. Around them, the nobles and courtiers waited, their stillness sharpened by anticipation. The older servant, the target of his earlier reprimand, had vanished into the crowd, retreating as discreetly as possible. The room seemed to have narrowed until it was just the two of them in a space measured by heartbeats and defiance. Edward straightened slightly, his voice shifting to carry once more across the hall. "This gathering is adjourned." The announcement broke the tension like a blade cleaving glass. Chairs scraped softly, silks rustled, and murmurs began to ripple through the assembly. No one approached them. The nobles filed out in orderly fashion, careful not to meet Margaret's eyes as they passed. The great doors groaned on their hinges before closing with a reverberating thud, leaving her alone with the man she had just insulted before his court. He didn't speak at once. Instead, he regarded her with a measured slowness, as if deciding which part of her to dismantle first, her resolve or her place in his household. But there was no obvious fury in his face. If anything, his calm was more disconcerting than the sharp temper she'd been warned about. "Your name," he said at last, the question shaped as a command. Her lips felt dry. "Margaret." "Your origin," she told him, each word deliberate, resisting the urge to fidget under his scrutiny. His gaze swept over her again, not in the crude, lingering way she'd endured from other men, but in an assessing, cataloging manner, as if he were assembling a portrait in his mind. "Follow me." It wasn't a request. He turned and walked toward the far end of the hall without glancing back to see if she obeyed. Something in the steadiness of his stride made her follow despite every instinct urging her to keep her distance. Her shoes clicked against the marble as she trailed behind him, past the empty chairs and discarded fans of ladies who had fled moments earlier. The hall's grandeur gave way to narrower corridors where tapestries muted their footsteps. The scents changed. Less perfume, more wax, and the faint aroma of burning coal from nearby hearths. Servants passed them, bowing quickly before moving on with eyes fixed forward. Margaret kept her gaze on the line of his back, the straight set of his shoulders. She tried to read something in the movement of his hands, clasped loosely behind him, but his body betrayed nothing. The air between them seemed charged, though, like the moment before a storm breaks. They passed through an arched doorway into a smaller antechamber, its walls paneled in dark wood. A tall clock ticked steadily in the corner, marking the silence between them. He did not slow. "You speak without permission," he said suddenly, his voice quieter now. "And yet you remain standing." She felt the warmth rise in her face but kept her chin level. "I spoke because no one else would." That earned a glance over his shoulder, brief but sharp, before he continued onward. Another turn brought them to a door she had not seen before, a heavy one of polished oak, its brass handle gleaming. He opened it himself and stepped inside. The room beyond was warmer, lit by the glow of a low fire in the hearth. Shelves lined with leather-bound volumes climbed to the ceiling. A writing desk stood near the window, scattered with papers, quills, and a single open ledger. "Inside," he instructed. She obeyed, stepping past him into the room. The door closed behind her with a decisive click that seemed to echo in her ears. Edward moved to the desk, leaning one hand on its edge while his eyes remained fixed on her. "Do you always speak your mind so freely?" Margaret swallowed. "When it's worth speaking." His mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile, but enough to suggest that her answer had not displeased him. "You've been in my household for 3 days." "Yes, Your Highness." "In that time, you've decided you know my character well enough to address me as you did today?" She hesitated. "I've seen enough of it." He studied her, as if weighing every syllable. Then he walked slowly toward her, stopping just close enough that she felt the faint shift in the air between them. His presence was like heat from a fire, not touching, yet impossible to ignore. "You think you know me," he murmured. "You don't." Margaret's pulse quickened, but she forced herself not to look away. The firelight flickered across the sharp planes of his face, casting shadows in the hollows of his cheekbones. He stood there for a breath longer before stepping past her toward the door. "Come," he said. She followed again, more from the instinct to keep him in sight than from obedience. They left the warmth of the study and re-entered the dim corridor. He led her through a side passage that twisted deeper into the castle. The sound of distant voices faded until there was only the muted thump of her heartbeat and the occasional creak of old timbers settling above them. She didn't know where they were going. The route was unfamiliar, each turn drawing them further from the parts of the castle she had glimpsed before. The light grew thinner, the windows narrower. At last, they emerged into another chamber, smaller than the main hall, but grand in its own right, with a tall hearth and a long table set with a single decanter of wine. He stopped in the center and turned to face her fully. "You have placed yourself in a dangerous position," he said. "Do you understand that?" Margaret drew a breath. "I understand that I spoke the truth." His eyes lingered on hers, and something passed between them. An unspoken challenge neither was willing to break first. The air seemed to press in around them, taut with the weight of what might follow. Then his gaze shifted, as if settling on some decision, and he took a step closer. His voice dropped to a low, unreadable tone. "Come with me. There is something you need to see." The words were delivered with such quiet certainty that Margaret found herself moving before she could form a protest. Edward crossed the chamber toward a narrow door set flush into the paneled wall. The latch gave with a soft metallic click, and he stepped through without looking back. She followed him into a corridor unlike any she had seen in the castle so far. The space was narrow, the ceiling lower, and the air faintly cooler, carrying the faint scent of linen and old paper. Their footsteps echoed softly against the stone, the rhythm of his stride unhurried but unwavering, as if he knew precisely where each turn would lead. The light here came from tall candles mounted in iron brackets, their flames swaying in the faint current stirred by their passing. Margaret's eyes adjusted slowly, and she took in the details. Polished floorboards beneath their feet, a series of doors evenly spaced along the walls, and the quiet dignity of a part of the castle meant for only a few. He said nothing until they reached the end of the passage. There, another door waited. This one of heavy oak, its surface unadorned except for the keyhole set deep into the wood. Edward drew a key from the pocket of his waistcoat, the gesture precise, as if unlocking this door were a task he did not entrust to anyone else. The hinges gave a low groan as the door swung inward. Margaret stepped in behind him, pausing just over the threshold. The chamber beyond was warmer, its air faintly perfumed by burning tallow and the tang of ink. A fire glowed in the hearth, casting long shadows against the walls lined with tall shelves of books. In the center stood a broad writing table, its surface littered with parchment, folded letters sealed in wax, and the faint gleam of brass instruments for measuring and marking. One window, draped in heavy velvet, allowed in a muted spill of light that fell across the room's rich carpet. Edward gestured toward the center of the floor. "Stand there." She obeyed, her gaze darting briefly to the objects on the desk. The arrangement was not disorderly, but it held the feel of a place often in use, a space for thought, planning, perhaps even secrets. "Why am I here?" she asked. He moved behind the desk, resting his hands lightly on the polished wood. "Because I wish to know more than your name and your birthplace. I wish to know what compels a servant, 3 days in my employ, to challenge me before the court." Her pulse thudded against her throat. "I told you. I spoke because it needed to be said." His gaze remained steady on hers. "That answer will not serve you in this castle. Here, every word spoken aloud is a stone in the wall you are building, or the one collapsing on you." Margaret held his gaze, refusing to look away. "Then I will choose my stones carefully." Something in his expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, as though he were re-evaluating her. He moved from behind the desk, his steps slow, measured. Stopping beside her, he looked down with a focus that made her acutely aware of the nearness of his body. She could hear the faint sound of the fire's crackle behind them, feel the ambient heat mingling with the faint spice of his cologne. "You do not look away," he murmured, more observation than accusation. "I've no reason to," she replied, though her voice betrayed the smallest tremor. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "We will see." He turned from her and crossed to the desk again, opening a drawer with deliberate care. From it, he drew a folded piece of parchment, its seal already broken. He held it by one edge, extending it toward her. Margaret hesitated before stepping forward to take it. The parchment was thick and smooth beneath her fingers, the ink dark and elegant in its script. Her eyes traced the lines, a correspondence addressed to the prince, the words laden with a careful civility that only made their meaning more troubling. The letter spoke of certain noblemen by name, men she had seen in the hall that morning, accompanied by terse notations about debts owed, lands exchanged, and meetings conducted in private. There were references to matters better left unwitnessed, and to the danger of overconfidence in public displays. The closing line struck her hardest, a caution against the prince's unfortunate tendency toward provocation. She looked up slowly. "Why show me this?" Edward's eyes held hers with unreadable intent. "Because you have already made yourself a subject of interest. Better to know the nature of the game before you are used as a piece in it." Margaret's chest tightened. "What game?" He stepped toward her, the letter still in her hands. "The one you entered the moment you opened your mouth in the hall." The firelight cast his features in sharp relief, the planes of his cheekbones, the cool light in his eyes. Margaret felt the weight of the parchment, the heat of the room, and the sudden realization that her act of defiance had rippled far beyond its moment. Before she could speak, the sound of urgent knocking cut through the stillness. 3 hard raps against the oak door. A muffled voice followed, urgent and low. "Your Highness, an important visitor has arrived." Margaret turned toward the sound, but her eyes returned to Edward quickly enough to see the brief tightening of his jaw, the flicker in his gaze that suggested this was not a welcome arrival. He looked toward the door, then back at her, his expression sharpening as though weighing a decision. Edward did not answer the knock immediately. His gaze held Margaret's as though he were trying to read her thoughts, to measure her usefulness, or her danger. The faintest stir of heat from the hearth brushed against the side of her face, but the air between them was colder now, threaded with an unspoken tension. When he finally moved, it was with a smooth economy of motion. He took the letter from her fingers without glancing down at it, folded it once, and slipped it back into the desk drawer. The knock came again, sharper this time. "Wait here," he said quietly, but there was no mistaking the command in his tone. Margaret watched as he strode to the door and opened it only a fraction. She caught a glimpse of a liveried servant, head bowed, speaking in hurried tones she couldn't quite distinguish. Whatever was said made Edward's shoulders stiffen slightly before he murmured a terse acknowledgement. He closed the door, turning back toward her. "You'll remain silent, and you'll remain here until I say otherwise. Do you understand?" Her instincts bristled at the order, but she gave a single nod. He studied her for a moment longer before moving to the far wall, where a narrow alcove was concealed behind a folding screen of dark wood and embroidered silk. "Behind there," he instructed, "and keep still." Margaret stepped into the alcove. From her position, she could see part of the desk and the door, though she was hidden from anyone who might enter. The fabric of the screen carried a faint scent of cedar, mingling with the smoke from the hearth. She placed her hands lightly against the cool wall behind her, steadying herself. The door opened again, this time fully, and Edward's voice adopted a polite neutrality. "My lord." A tall man entered, his dark coat cut in the height of fashion, silver buttons gleaming under the dim light. His powdered hair framed a face of practiced composure, though the curve of his mouth suggested a man accustomed to speaking with authority. He did not bow deeply, only enough to satisfy courtesy. "Your Highness," the visitor said, his tone edged with familiarity. Edward gestured toward the center of the room, but the man declined the offer to sit, remaining upright with one hand resting lightly on the hilt of his walking stick. His eyes swept the chamber with a glance that was too deliberate to be casual. "I thought it best to call on you without delay," the man said. "Certain rumors are making their way through the corridors." "Rumors often do," Edward replied evenly. From her vantage point, Margaret could see the visitor's jaw tighten, as if restraining the urge to speak more bluntly. "It is said you've taken a renewed interest in matters that might unbalance the court." "Interest," Edward repeated, letting the word hang between them. "Is it now forbidden to take interest in one's own household?" The man's gaze sharpened. "There are interests, and there are provocations. You would do well to distinguish between them." The faint creak of Edward's chair was the only sound for a moment. He leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "If you came to offer counsel, my lord, I thank you. If you came to deliver a warning, I assure you I am not in the habit of misplacing them." Margaret could sense the hostility threaded beneath the civility. The visitor's posture was relaxed in appearance, but carried the readiness of a man accustomed to confrontation. "There is unrest in certain estates," the man said finally. "Whispers that might trouble your position if they were to reach the wrong ears. Best to quell such things early, before they grow teeth." Edward's voice was quiet, but its weight pressed against the walls. "And whose ears do you imagine to be the wrong ones?" The visitor smiled faintly, though it did not reach his eyes. "We both know the answer to that." They regarded each other for a long, motionless moment. Margaret, barely daring to breathe, caught fragments of meaning between their words, threads that connected to the letter she had read. The names in that correspondence, the debts, the veiled accusations, seemed to shimmer at the edges of their exchange. At last, the man inclined his head, a gesture more of closure than deference. "I will not take more of your time." Edward rose, offering the barest nod in return. The visitor turned on his heel and left the room, the sound of his footsteps fading into the corridor beyond. For a moment, Edward remained where he was, his gaze fixed on the closed door. The stillness was absolute, broken only by the muffled crackle of the fire. Then he turned toward the alcove. "Step out," he said. Margaret emerged slowly from behind the screen, the air feeling different now, as if the conversation she had overheard had left a trace in the room. Edward's eyes found hers with a sharper edge than before. "There is something else you need to see," he said, "and you will see it now." Edward did not wait for her consent. He crossed the room in 3 decisive strides, opening the door and stepping into the corridor. Margaret followed, compelled by something beyond obedience, by the unsettled curiosity that had been growing in her since the moment she spoke out in the main hall. The passageway beyond was dimmer now, lit by wall sconces whose flames flickered in the draught rising from somewhere deep within the castle. Their footsteps echoed off the stone, the rhythm of his stride brisk enough that she had to lengthen hers to keep pace. Servants they passed drew instantly to the side, pressing themselves against the wall, heads bowed until he was gone. They reached a narrow door at the end of the passage, unremarkable but for the heavy lock that secured it. Edward drew a key from his coat, the metal catching the light in a brief flash, before it turned in the lock with a quiet, deliberate click. Beyond the door, a steep stair descended into shadow. A colder air rose to meet them, carrying with it the faint dry scent of old stone and something metallic, like the tang of coins or keys. Edward took a candle from a bracket just inside the threshold, shielding its flame with his palm as they began the descent. Margaret kept close behind him, her hand grazing the rough wall for balance. The sound of their steps against the worn stone felt loud in the confined space. She could feel her own breath warm against the chill. At the base of the stairs, another door awaited, a heavier one, banded in iron, with a bolt as thick as her wrist. A single guard stood beside it, his livery marked by the royal crest. He straightened at their approach, offering a silent bow before stepping aside. Edward slid the bolt free himself, the scrape of metal loud in the stillness, and pushed the door open. The chamber beyond was lit by a single oil lamp on a table in the center, its light pooling over the surface and leaving the corners in shadow. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with ledgers, sealed boxes, and rolls of parchment tied with twine. The air was thick with the must of age and the faint waxy scent of the lamp. Edward moved directly to the far wall, where a chest sat beneath the lowest shelf. He knelt, fitting another key into its lock. The hinges groaned as the lid lifted, revealing bundles of papers, some neatly tied, others worn at the edges from frequent handling. He set several on the table, spreading them so the lamplight revealed lists of names, numbers, and notations in a tight, economical script. Margaret recognized at least two of the names from the letter he had shown her earlier. Here, though, they were not alone. They were linked to amounts of money, parcels of land, and brief coded phrases that suggested debts, obligations, or leverage. "What is this?" she asked softly. His eyes flicked to hers. "A record of those who owe and those who collect." She glanced at the shelves around them, feeling the weight of what these ledgers might contain. "And you keep it here?" "I keep what must be protected from prying eyes," he said. "Even those who think themselves entitled to see everything." Margaret's fingers itched to touch the parchment, to trace the lines that hinted at the invisible ties binding the nobility together, and to him. The paper smelled faintly of dust and ink, the marks pressed deep enough into the fibers to suggest a firm, deliberate hand. "Why show me this?" she asked. Edward's gaze did not waver. "Because now you have seen too much to be left wandering the corridors ignorant of it. And because I need to know whether your defiance in the hall was a moment's impulse or the measure of your nature." Her chest tightened at the challenge implicit in his words. "And if it was my nature?" His mouth curved faintly, though not with amusement. "Then you may prove useful, or dangerous." Before she could answer, the faint sound of movement reached them. Footsteps above, slow but unmistakable. Edward stilled, his head tilting slightly as though measuring the distance. Then came another sound, the soft, metallic whisper of a blade being drawn. He extinguished the lamp with a swift pinch of his fingers, plunging them into shadow. The faint glow from the open stairwell above was the only light left, outlining the angles of his face as he stepped toward her. "Stay close," he murmured, his voice low enough to blend with the stillness. The footsteps grew louder, the creak of leather, and the faint jingle of metal closer now. Margaret's pulse thudded in her ears. Edward's hand rested briefly at the small of her back, guiding her toward the deeper shadow of a shelving unit. The first figure appeared at the top of the stairs, the dim light from the corridor glinting off the steel of a drawn sword. Another followed, their movements deliberate, controlled. Edward shifted his stance subtly, one hand behind his back as the other rested at his side, poised for a sudden motion. The air in the chamber seemed to shrink, tightening around the sound of each descending step. Margaret pressed herself against the wall, the roughness of the stone cool through the fabric of her gown. Her breath was shallow, her eyes fixed on the figures moving closer, the steel in their hands catching the dim light. One of the men reached the bottom of the stairs, his gaze sweeping the room. His head turned, the shadows hiding much of his expression, but she felt the weight of his attention. Then his eyes fixed in her direction, and he began to cross the chamber, each step deliberate, until his hand reached toward the crates concealing her from view. Margaret's breath caught as the man's shadow fell over her hiding place. The faint lamplight from the stairwell glinted on the steel in his hand, the blade angled downward but ready. His boots made a muted scrape against the stone floor as he closed the last bit of distance. She could hear the faint rasp of his breathing, could almost feel the reach of his arm before it touched her. A sudden controlled movement from Edward drew the man's attention. With a deceptively casual step forward, the prince placed himself between the intruder and the crates, his posture loose, but his gaze like tempered steel. "This wing is restricted," Edward said, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that made the words resonate in the stillness. "State your business." The intruder hesitated just long enough for two more figures to reach the bottom of the stairs. Their presence filled the narrow space with an oppressive heat, the tang of oiled leather and cold metal thickening the air. The leader's stance shifted subtly, his free hand curling near the hilt of his sword in an unspoken challenge. "I believe you know our business," the man replied, his tone holding a shade too much familiarity. Margaret pressed herself closer to the crates, every sense sharpened. From her position, she could see the angle of Edward's shoulders, the slight bend in his knees, a stance prepared for either conversation or confrontation. "I was not informed of any inspection," Edward said, "nor of any permission granted to enter here armed." The leader's mouth curved in something that was not a smile. "We thought it wiser not to trouble you with formalities." The quiet that followed was taut enough to snap. Margaret could hear the faint drip of water somewhere beyond the chamber, each sound marking the seconds in which Edward did not move, did not look away. "You've overstepped," he said finally. The man's hand flexed on the hilt of his sword. "We've been sent to ensure certain matters remain contained." His glance flicked to the shelves, then to the chest on the table, lingering just long enough to make his meaning clear. Edward's voice dropped a fraction. "You will not touch anything in this room." The leader took a single step closer. "And if I do?" Margaret could sense the danger in the space between them, a taut wire pulled to its limit. She caught the faintest shift of Edward's weight, as though ready to cut the wire before it snapped. From behind the leader, one of the other men began to move toward the far side of the chamber. Edward's gaze flicked briefly in that direction, then back. The smallest motion of his hand, barely visible, told Margaret to be ready. Her heartbeat thudded against her ribs. She didn't know what she was ready for, only that something was about to break. The man nearest her moved again, and the sound of his boots against the stone was like the scrape of a knife along metal. In the next instant, Edward stepped sharply into the leader's space, his voice a quiet blade. "Leave." The other man froze mid-step. The leader's eyes narrowed. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, with deliberate slowness, the man in front of Edward shifted his grip on the sword, not to sheath it, but to hold it lower, as though in warning. Margaret's skin prickled. Every breath seemed too loud. The leader's gaze broke from Edward long enough to sweep the shadows again, his eyes passing over her hiding place. His hand twitched, and he took a step toward her, this time without hesitation. Edward's voice cut the air. "You take one more step," he said softly, "and you will not take another." The man's weight shifted forward, testing the threat, and then he moved. Steel hissed as the leader committed, the bright line of his blade cutting the air toward Edward's shoulder. The prince turned in a quick, contained motion, the attack skimming past his coat by a hair's breadth. The ring of metal against stone echoed when the sword's tip nicked the edge of a shelf. Dust shook loose from the ledges above, glittering in the thin light. "Stand down," Edward said, the command steady, almost quiet, as if he were instructing a servant to leave a decanter be. The man answered with a sharp thrust. Edward pivoted, seizing the intruder's wrist just below the guard. The motion was as precise as his speech, the force of it surprising for a man who rarely raised his voice. He drove the wrist downward, deflecting the blade to the floor. Sparks flared with the scrape. Behind the leader, one of the others lurched forward, emboldened by noise. Margaret flinched but did not cry out. She pressed closer to the crates, the wood cool against her palms. The scent of oiled leather and cold iron thickened the air until she tasted it, metallic on her tongue. "Don't," the leader snapped, not taking his eyes from Edward. The second man halted, disciplined, then, or afraid. Margaret's breathing steadied around the edges of panic. She could see the outline of Edward's jaw, the narrow column of his throat, the flex of his hand around the intruder's wrist. It wasn't brute strength that held the man in check. It was leverage, knowledge of where to press, when to yield, how to become the axis on which another's violence lost balance. "Your orders," Edward said, voice colder now, "do not extend to threatening my person in my own house. They extend," the man ground out, "to ensuring you don't take more than you're owed." "I don't take," Edward replied softly. "I collect." Margaret felt the truth of that in the room around them, the ledgers hemming them in, the chest with its tidy secrets, the careful lines of script where other men's choices were pinned to paper like insects. Collect. The word settled on her skin like a chill. The leader wrenched his arm free with a violent twist. Edward let it go rather than risk being pulled off balance. Another beat of silence. Then a third figure shifted near the stairwell, blade low, waiting for a signal that didn't come. "You're trespassing in a restricted wing," Edward said. "If you walk out now, I will assume you misunderstood your instructions. If you don't, you will discover how dearly a misunderstanding costs." The leader gave a short laugh, humorless. "There's no misunderstanding. It's the price that interests me." He moved again, testing. Edward met him. One step, two. Close enough that the breath between them turned sharp. Their blades didn't clash. No blade in Edward's hand at all, only the iron of his will. He crowded the man backward with nothing but presence and the certainty that he'd be obeyed. The leader's smile faltered. In another second, the moment might have turned surrender or open violence, when a fourth figure slipped past the first two and angled toward the side of the chamber where the crates stood deeper in shadow. Margaret saw him only as a dark edge and the flash of a blade's fuller. He didn't look at Edward, he looked for disruption, for weakness. She drew a breath that felt too loud in her chest. Edward's gaze flicked, quick as a knife. "Stop." The man did not. Margaret braced. She wasn't sure for what. Shouting, a lunge, the cold arc of steel. It was none of those. Edward moved with a suddenness that hardly seemed possible in the low light, releasing the leader and crossing the chamber in 3 precise strides. His shoulder met the intruder's chest with enough force to stagger him, to jar the sword arm wide. The blade struck a shelf. The dull thud of wood, the clap of a ledger falling, papers shivering into the air like startled birds. The second man reacted, coming at Edward's back. Margaret's throat tightened. She pushed from behind the crates before she had time to think better of it. Her hand closed over the nearest object, an inkwell left uncorked on a low table, and she hurled it. The inkwell struck the floor at the attacker's feet, shattering, black liquid fanning slick across the stone. His boot slid. He cursed, weight pitching, the tip of his blade scraping sparks. Edward didn't waste the moment. He caught the staggered man's shoulder and twisted, sending him hard into the shelf. Wood groaned. Another ledger fell open, pages splayed like a broken fan. The leader recovered fast, breath rasping, and swung for Edward's ribs. The stroke wasn't elegant. It was meant to maim. Edward dropped, the blade carving the air above his coat. As he came up, he drove his forearm into the man's sword wrist again. The weapon jerked free and clattered to the floor. "Pick it up," the leader snarled at the man sliding in ink. "No," Edward said, and the word was all steel. "No one touches anything." For a moment, there was only the crackle of the stairwell torch and the faint, steady sound of someone's harsh breathing. Hers, she realized. Hers. She had moved beyond the crates now, a misstep that made cold bloom along her spine even as heat rose to her face. Edward didn't look at her, but the line of his body shifted almost imperceptibly, angling himself to place her behind the breadth of his shoulder. "Leave," he said again. "You've seen enough." The leader's gaze tracked over Edward's shoulder. It landed on her. Recognition flared. Of opportunity, not of person. He smiled then, slow and ugly. "Not quite." Margaret's fingers tightened around nothing. The inkwell was gone, its shards glistening black on the floor. She forced herself not to retreat. Retreat would be a promise of pursuit. "Your quarrel is with me," Edward said. "You will not touch her." The man tilted his head, that awful smile deepening. "Then you'll come with us, Highness?" "No." A quiet refusal, unadorned. The leader's eyes narrowed. He feinted toward Margaret, testing the edge of Edward's refusal, the reach of his patience. The prince didn't rise to it. He simply stepped a fraction to block the line. That was enough. The leader's decision was made in the flash of a glance. He signaled with 2 fingers. The man at the stairs moved, not toward Edward, but along the wall, seeking the far end of the chamber where a narrow servant's passage hid behind a hanging drape. An escape route, or a trap. Margaret knew then that the walls themselves would work against them if they stayed. The room's secrecy, its distance from the household, had become a snare. She felt the tightness in Edward's silence and understood. He had to end this now, or risk being boxed in by men who would call the darkness their ally. "Last warning," Edward said. "Walk out." The leader's blade lifted a hair, held in 2 fingers like a dare. "Make me." They moved at once. The second man lunged first, boots skidding on ink, his blade skittering wide. Edward's hand shot out, catching his wrist, turning with the motion, sending the arm past him. The sword struck stone, rang, fell. The leader came next, quick and low. Edward blocked with his forearm, the impact dull and heavy. Pain flared along his jaw. Margaret saw it in the brief tightening around his mouth. He answered with a sharp, efficient strike to the ribs that made the leader grunt and stagger back. "Out!" the leader barked to the man at the drape. "Find the records!" "No." The word hammered in Margaret's skull. She moved without waiting for instruction, catching the edge of a fallen ledger with her foot and kicking it hard across the floor. It slid, struck the man's shin, upset his balance just as he yanked the drape aside. Cold air spilled from the narrow passage beyond. He swore. Edward's head snapped in her direction, surprise ghosting over his expression. Then approval, cooler, but unmistakable. "Stay behind me," he ordered, not looking away from the leader. "I won't be dragged out like a thief," the leader said, breath harsh now. "You've locked yourself in a vault and called it a fortress." "A vault," Edward agreed. "My vault." He closed the distance, not with a rush, but with that relentless control that unnerved more than fury. The leader stepped back, calculating. His men looked to him for the next command, and found none. Uncertainty slid through the room like a draft. "Listen carefully," Edward said, voice low. "You will unhand your weapons. You will walk back up those stairs, and you will attempt to persuade your betters that you never found what you were sent to find. And if we refuse?" The prince's gaze didn't waver. "You won't." Silence again, until the man at the drape made a different calculation. He turned his head toward Margaret, measuring distance, speed, the angle of Edward's body, and chose the one leverage point within reach. He darted along the wall, keeping out of the prince's immediate line, and in 3 quick steps crossed into the dim where the crates cast their longest shadows. He reached, hand open, closing toward the fabric at her sleeve to yank her forward into sight. Margaret saw his hand coming before she felt the movement of air it stirred. Instinct snapped through her like a wire pulled taut. She twisted away, her shoulder grazing the edge of the crates, and slipped out of his reach by the narrowest margin. The man's fingers closed on nothing, his momentum carrying him half a step too far. Edward was there in an instant. He caught the intruder by the back of his coat, the fabric bunching in his grip, and yanked him away from her with such force that the man stumbled. The scrape of boots on stone was followed by the dull crack of shoulder meeting the wall. "I told you," Edward said, voice low but cutting. "She is not yours to touch." The leader's expression darkened, his lips pulling tight as his gaze darted between Margaret and the prince. The other two men shifted uneasily, their confidence fraying at the edges. The air was charged, the kind of charge before lightning splits the sky, and Margaret could almost hear the collective beat of held breaths. Edward didn't release the man at once. He kept him pinned against the wall long enough for the others to register the warning in the act. Then, with a short shove, he sent him staggering back toward the center of the chamber. "You've run out of room," Edward said, "and soon you'll run out of luck." The leader's jaw worked as if chewing over the taste of retreat. "Perhaps," he said finally. "But I've seen enough to know you're guarding more than gold." "You've seen nothing worth the risk you've taken," Edward replied. "And if you wish to walk out, you'll leave now." For a moment, it seemed the man might challenge him again. But something, whether the flicker of soldiers' boots echoing faintly from the corridor above, or the calculation in Edward's steady gaze, shifted the weight in his decision. The leader flicked 2 fingers toward the stairwell. His men obeyed, moving with a forced steadiness that did nothing to hide the tension in their shoulders. One retrieved his fallen blade, but held it pointed toward the floor. They began to withdraw, but Edward didn't relax. He kept himself between Margaret and the intruders, his stance still sharp enough to answer any sudden turn. She stayed close behind him, the faint scent of leather and clean linen from his coat grounding her even as her pulse beat in her ears. The first man reached the stairs. Boots scuffed on stone as they began their ascent, one after another, their shadows stretching up the walls. The leader was the last to move, his eyes never leaving Edward's. "This isn't finished," he said. Edward didn't blink. "It is for tonight." The man gave a short, derisive breath and turned to climb. The scrape of their steps faded until only the steady pop of the hearth fire remained. For a long moment, the room was silent. Margaret let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Edward turned to face her, his eyes searching hers with a quiet intensity. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, though her throat felt tight. "No." His gaze lingered a fraction longer, as if confirming the truth for himself. Then he looked toward the stairwell again, listening. "They'll try again," she said, her voice low. "Yes," he replied simply, "which is why we can't stay here." He crossed the chamber in purposeful strides, moving toward the rear wall, where the heavy drape still hung askew over the narrow servants' passage. With one hand, he swept the fabric aside, revealing the shadowed opening beyond. Cold air spilled in, carrying the faint scent of damp stone and something faintly metallic. "This way," he said. Margaret hesitated, glancing back at the chest on the table, the scattered ledgers, the ink still glistening dark on the floor. "What about?" "Leave them," Edward cut in. "We have what matters most." He didn't explain further, and she didn't press. She stepped toward him, the hem of her gown brushing the scattered shards of the inkwell. Edward waited for her to enter the passage first, his hand steady at the small of her back as she stepped into the narrow darkness. The space was close, the walls brushing her shoulders in places, the air colder still. Their footsteps were muted here, swallowed by the old stone. She kept her eyes on the faint glimmer of light ahead, her senses taut, aware of him close behind her. The passage curved twice before ending in a steep stair that led upward. At the top, Edward opened a door just wide enough to scan the corridor beyond. The muffled sounds of the household reached them now, distant voices, the faint clatter of dishes, the low hum of normal life far from the shadows below. He stepped through, and she followed, blinking against the change in light. They were in a long gallery lined with tall windows, the faint silver of moonlight spilling through the glass. Outside, the courtyard lay still, its cobblestones pale under the night sky. Edward's pace was quick but unhurried, a calculated stride that would not draw attention should they meet anyone. The echo of their steps seemed louder in the open space. They turned into another corridor, this one lined with gilt-framed portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow them. The warmth of the castle's upper floors was immediate after the chill below, carrying the sense of polished wood and faint perfume. Margaret could feel the remnants of her fear slowly turning into something else, something sharper, more questioning. "Why show me all of this?" she asked quietly. Edward didn't look at her. "Because once you spoke in that hall, you stopped being invisible. And invisible is the only safe thing to be here." His words stayed with her as they moved through another set of doors and into a smaller hallway. The air felt heavier here, the quiet more pronounced. Somewhere close, a door creaked open, followed by the faint step of approaching boots. Edward slowed, his head tilting slightly in that same listening way she'd seen before. The steps were steady, drawing closer from around the bend. Margaret's breath caught as the figure appeared at the end of the corridor, one of the intruders, sword drawn, standing squarely in their path. For a beat, everything narrowed to the blade's bright edge and the steady rise and fall of the man's chest. Margaret felt the corridor's chill tug along her sleeves, the faint draft raising a shiver that had nothing to do with cold. Edward shifted half a step in front of her, the measured movement placing the breadth of his shoulder between the sword and her. The portraits on the wall seemed to lean closer, candlelight skimming their varnished faces as if the dead would witness the living. "Drop it," Edward said, the quiet firm enough to pass for iron. The intruder didn't blink. His stance was competent, soldierly rather than feral, which told her he answered to someone's chain of command. He drew a breath, the blade's tip steady, and glanced beyond Edward to the gallery they had just crossed. Calculating, looking for a path he could carve with steel. Margaret heard footsteps, faint, distant, approaching from somewhere behind. One set, no clatter of a group, no help for him yet, no guarantee for her either. She could see the firmness in Edward's jaw, the gathered restraint, as if he were measuring how much force the moment required and nothing more. "You don't want this," Edward said. The man smiled without humor. "I was told to want nothing else. Then your orders were poorly given." A breath of silence, taut and small. The intruder weighed the reply as if sound itself could tilt the decision. Edward's hand shifted minutely, spreading his fingers, the gesture both warning and balance. Margaret felt the pull of two possible futures stretch thin in the air, one cut by steel, one not. "Look up," Edward said suddenly, his voice crisp. It wasn't a trick of distraction, it was command. He raised his own voice half a measure and let it travel the corridor. "Captain." The name cut through the hush like a bell. The intruder's eyes flicked past Edward's shoulder. Margaret turned her head in the same instant. Reflex, fear, hope, and saw the disciplined shape of a uniform rounding the corner at the far end. The castle's captain of the guard, red-faced from speed, followed by a hard line of armed soldiers, whose boots struck the stone in clean cadence. Their arrival carried the authority of the household, the kind that did not argue but simply took place. "Stand down," the captain barked, already raising one hand for halt and the other to signal encirclement. The intruder hesitated, one dangerous heartbeat too long, then jerked his blade a fraction, as if to demand a hostage's leverage he'd already lost. Edward didn't give him time to find the angle. He moved in with the same precise economy he'd used below stairs, closing the space and locking the man's wrist. The sword's point dipped. Another guard seized the intruder's other arm. Metal rang once, brief and final, as the blade hit the floor and skittered against the baseboard. "Secure him," Edward said, voice cool, not raised. "The others?" "Taken," the captain answered. "Two at the west stair, one limping, all under guard. We followed the commotion from below. His gaze flicked to Margaret, formal concern under hard discipline. Your Highness, my lady, are you harmed? No, Margaret said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Her heart was pounding, yes, but its violent rhythm had started to settle into something she could breathe around. Edward gave her a quick glance that felt like a touch along the length of her spine. Confirmation, acknowledgement, then back to command. Search him, Edward said, and you will not damage anything you remove from his person. I will have the inventory exact. Gloved hands moved with brisk efficiency. A knife from the boot, a folded scrap from the waistcoat, a signet ring tucked into a pocket. Not worn, kept. Not the crest of the household. Margaret noted the small details because they steadied her. The way the guards worked without clamoring voices or show, the way the captain nodded once and nothing more as each item was produced. This was a castle that knew how to keep itself. Who sent you? The captain demanded of the intruder. The man stared at the floorboards as if he could read a safer answer there. He kept his mouth closed. The captain's jaw flexed, displeased, but he didn't press, not with the prince watching, not with purpose already given. Edward's tone cut clear. You will be questioned properly. Take him to the guardroom, keep him separate from the others. Yes, Highness. The line of soldiers shifted. A formation opened, closed, and the intruder was moving, under control, a weapon that had failed to cut its appointed path. His boots knocked once against the discarded sword. The metal skittered a foot and came to rest with its hilt turned from him. A small humiliation Margaret found herself oddly grateful to see. Another guard presented the folded scrap taken from the man's waistcoat. Found this on him, sir. Edward accepted it. Margaret watched the way his fingers handled the paper, careful, unhurried, before he opened it. She couldn't see the writing, only the momentary cooling of his expression as he took in whatever the lines said. He folded it shut again and passed it to the captain. Keep that with him. The captain slid the paper into a leather wallet and tucked it inside his coat. We'll hold them under full watch. Good. Edward's gaze traveled over the soldiers, a brief measure of readiness and loyalty. Post 2 at the entrance to the restricted wing and another at the stair from below. No one enters without my order. Aye. The captain lifted 2 fingers. Men detached themselves from the line and moved with crisp purpose. As the group withdrew with their prisoner, the corridor's scale seemed to change, as if the tension had warped the space and now released it. Margaret inhaled slowly and discovered the air didn't sting her lungs. She was suddenly, acutely aware of the candle flame's small sway in the draught and the polished gleam along the chair rail. Mundane details snuck back into the world, as if to reassure her it still existed. Edward looked at her again. Longer this time, less for wounds and more for… what? Proof that she remained herself after fear? She stood straighter under the weight of his regard, the rise of her breath easing, and nodded once. I'm well. He said nothing to that, but the angle of his mouth altered, easing the severity by a shade. He ran a hand along the cuff of his coat, smoothing a crease that hadn't been there before, and turned to the captain. Have the others kept apart from each other and from anyone who might wish to coach them? No messages in or out. We'll see to it. And send word to me when they begin speaking, Edward added. They will. People who take orders also take fear. The captain's eyes sharpened with approval. Yes, Highness. When the last soldier's step faded and the corridor cleared, the hush that followed felt different, weighted not with danger, but with a wary calm. Margaret realized her palms were damp and rubbed them lightly against her skirts, feeling the fine grain of the fabric catch at her skin. The portraits along the wall, dim with age and smoke, resumed their permanent watch, the living forgiven their brief, loud interruption. Walk with me, Edward said quietly. She fell into step beside him. They moved through the corridor not quickly, but with a shared purpose that asked less of their feet and more of their breaths settling into the same rhythm. Margaret felt the cords of tension loosen in increments. The castle's familiar scents gathered them back in. Beeswax, old wood, the feathery trace of a lady's perfume lingering long after its wearer had gone. "They won't vanish," Edward said at last, his voice pitched for her alone. "Not this time." "You've contained it," she said. The word felt functional, not triumphant. It wasn't an ending. It was the stopping of a leak before the wall failed. For now. He glanced down at her. Containment is the beginning of truth. She considered that, the phrase clicking into place with what she'd seen. The ledgers, the chest, the letter, the line of soldiers obeying without waste. "You were right to call them," she said, thinking of the captain's arrival, the sudden coalescence of order around them. "I was right," he agreed, and something gentler threaded his tone. "But I would have been less right alone." The words reached her like warmth after a draft, cautious acknowledgement rather than praise. She felt her throat constrict for an instant and looked ahead to steady herself. They passed a tall window. The courtyard below lay stripped and pale under the night, stones gleaming faintly as if the moon had polished each one with a damp cloth. "Will they be questioned tonight?" she asked. "Yes." He didn't slow. "The household sleeps better when threats are made to explain themselves." "And if they don't?" "They will," he said again, but not with arrogance, with the quiet conviction of a man who had watched men change shape under the pressure of consequence. They turned into a smaller passage where the walls closed in with paneled warmth and the floor didn't echo. The nearness of him was no longer about danger. It was about the way his presence had become an anchor when the ground wanted to tilt. "You should rest," he said. "You've earned it." "Sleep will be a stubborn thing," she said. Honest, because there seemed no point in crafting an answer for a man who had watched her courage and fear in equal measure. "It often is," he replied. "But it comes sooner in safety." She almost smiled at that, almost, because the day's edges were still too sharp to soften. "Is that what this is?" "For tonight," he said. "Yes." They walked a few more paces without speaking. The quiet felt kindly rather than cold. Margaret became aware of the cadence of her steps matching his and, irrationally, wanted to keep it that way for another hallway, another turn, another breath. A door at the far end opened. A maid poked her head out, saw them, and disappeared again with the soundless efficiency of someone trained to erase herself from a path. The castle had resumed its habits. That, too, felt like safety. When they reached a junction where one corridor split into three, Edward paused and looked down at her with a gravity that felt like a hand resting lightly at the center of her chest. "You will stay to the main passages," he said. "Not the hidden ones, not for now." She nodded. She understood. Privacy was a luxury. Invisibility was a hazard. "And you?" "I'll speak with the captain and see what our intruders think of their bravery in better light." She met his gaze, holding it a fraction longer than protocol required. "Be careful." A small line eased at the corner of his eye. "I will," he said, as if he meant it for her rather than for himself. He inclined his head in a gesture that was not quite dismissal, not quite farewell, then turned toward the guard rooms. Margaret watched him take 3 steps, 4, the measured set of his shoulders never wavering, and felt the day's peril recede one measured breath at a time as the castle settled back into its uneasy calm. Later that evening, the castle was steeped in a quiet so complete that every small sound seemed amplified, the faint hiss of the hearth, the slow tick of a distant clock. Margaret sat alone in the small room assigned to her in the servants' wing, the single candle on the table burning low enough to pool its light in amber over her hands. She was folding linens, though without much attention to the task. The cloth rested slack between her fingers, while her mind replayed the day's events with a clarity that kept her pulse uncomfortably quick. A knock came, firm but not hurried. She rose, smoothing her skirts, and opened the door. Edward stood in the corridor, his coat unbuttoned, his expression stripped of the rigid composure she had seen so often. The candlelight caught along his jaw, warm against the pale angles. "Your Highness," she began. but he stepped past the threshold with the easy confidence of a man who had already decided he belonged in the space. He closed the door quietly behind him, the latch settling into place with a soft, final sound. "I thought you might not be sleeping," he said. His voice was low, carrying less command than it did in the hallways of the day, but still holding the certainty of a man used to being heard. She set the folded linen on the table, willing her hands to still. "No, not yet." He moved farther into the small room, the space seeming to shrink with the weight of his presence. "Nor have I," he admitted. It seemed. His gaze swept over her face, lingering for a moment longer than she expected. Unwise to leave the day as it ended. Margaret's throat tightened, but she kept her voice even. "It ended without blood in the corridor. That seems a mercy worth keeping." "A mercy," he agreed, his mouth shifting faintly. "But not an ending." The air between them was heavier now, woven with the shared memory of the danger that had pressed so close. She could still recall the exact scent of the ledger's dust, the gleam of a drawn blade in dim light, the measured way he had placed himself between her and harm. "You spoke earlier," he said, "of acting because no one else would." She met his gaze. "I did." "You were right," he said simply. The words landed with a weight she didn't expect. Not flattery, not condescension, just the quiet admission of truth. Something in her chest eased, though the tension that replaced it was of a different sort entirely. "You've changed something, Margaret," he went on, his voice almost thoughtful. "In this castle. In me." Her breath caught at the unguarded way he said it, as if the thought had been waiting to be spoken aloud. "I didn't mean to change you," she said. "No," he murmured. "That's why it matters." He stepped closer, until the warm flicker of the candlelight touched both of them. She could feel the nearness of him in the way her own breathing shifted, slower and deeper, to match the quiet pull of his. His hand lifted, not touching, only hovering near the edge of her sleeve, as if asking without words. Margaret didn't move away. She let the moment lengthen, let it steady itself in the silence. "Everything here is watched," he said. "We measure every word, every step. But this," his voice softened, "this is not for them to see." Her pulse thudded in her ears, the sound impossibly loud in the small room. "And what is it for?" she asked. "For us," he said. The words struck her with a force she hadn't prepared for, not after the endless guard of the day. Something in her, tight, braced, waiting, unwound enough to leave her almost unsteady. He reached then, fingers brushing lightly along her sleeve, the touch no more than a whisper, but enough to make her aware of every inch of space between them. She could see the faint strain at the edge of his composure, the desire tempered by control. "You've been in my thoughts since the hall," he said. "Not only for what you said, for the way you said it." Margaret drew in a slow breath. "And what way was that?" "As if you saw me," he answered. "Not the title, not the fear others carry. Me." She held his gaze, letting the truth in his words settle. "Perhaps I did." For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then his hand slid from her sleeve to her wrist, the contact light but deliberate, his thumb brushing against the rapid beat beneath her skin. The warmth of his touch was startling in its gentleness. "If I were wiser," he said quietly, "I would leave now." Her voice was steady when she replied, "Perhaps I would stop you." That drew a low sound from him, something between amusement and something darker. The space between them closed, not hurried, but inevitable, until the faint heat of his breath touched her cheek. "Margaret," he said, as if her name were the answer to a question he hadn't spoken. She didn't look away. "Yes." The distance dissolved. His hand lifted to her jaw, his thumb tracing the line where her pulse raced beneath the skin. Her own hands rose without thought, resting lightly at his chest where the steady beat of his heart met her touch. The kiss, when it came, was unhurried, measured in the way he had measured his steps in danger, precise in its intent, but with a depth that held no calculation. It was both a claim and a question, the kind that left her breathless when they parted only enough to look at each other. "I told myself this was the wrong time," he said softly. "But I think time is the least of what we have to fear." Her lips curved faintly. "Then perhaps we shouldn't waste it." Something in his expression, relief, resolve, desire, shifted as he leaned in again. The candle flickered once, throwing their shadows long across the wall before steadying in the still air. And in that quiet, she knew that nothing in the castle would be the same come morning. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you like the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.